Hello, this is Pastor Matthew Woods, and this is the daily update for Good Friday, 2020. It's Friday. Today I thought about doing something a little different. Today I thought it best to travel down the Via Dolorosa, the Way of Sorrows, as Jesus did perhaps on that Good Friday. Our written content today, by the way, will include Bible references, so you'll know where some of these segments come from, and you can go back and read those for yourself. We start our journey at daybreak. Since Jesus' arrest in the garden, the religious leaders have run a marathon session of trials throughout the night. By sunrise, Jesus is hauled before the high priest, Caiaphas. The hateful religious leaders and many false witnesses have convicted Jesus totally on a fixed trial. And so these so-called religious leaders mock Jesus. They have spit on Jesus. They have blindfolded Jesus. And one by one, they have struck Jesus. Prophesy to us, who hit you? After that, the guards beat him some more. Every bit of that night of the trials was illegal. And every bit of that night was cruel to Jesus. Now, no doubt by morning, Jesus' face was badly bruised and swelling. And this begins the suffering. We see the denial of Peter, of course, while Jesus is inside. Peter is on the outside in the courtyard. The disciples had long abandoned Jesus except Peter. He somehow managed to find a way into the courtyard. And by morning, Peter was still defending himself with the third and strongest denial of them all, that he doesn't know Jesus. And the very bruised and wounded Jesus, as cock crows, this comes together at the same time. Jesus looks across the courtyard as he walks out of those sessions, looks straight at Peter. And Peter, as that rooster crowed, remembered what Jesus had said about him, and he ran out bitterly. Peter's heart was flooded with shame and left the courtyard in that shame, weeping bitterly. Then comes the official condemnation of Jesus. Now it's time to get it on the record. To make the verdict of the Sanhedrin, the ruling body, legal, they finally had to record it, and that could only be done after daybreak. They condemned Jesus of blasphemy, for they heard from him directly that he was the Son of God. They would not believe him. They thought that, instead, a reason to kill him. The first trial, then, before Pilate, because they did not want to actually have blood on their hands, especially for someone so famous as Jesus, they decided to take it to Rome and let Rome take the brunt of the fury of the people who thought him so popular. It would be like a two for one deal. Kill two birds with one stone. Kill Jesus and blame the Romans again. Caiaphas, in reality, wanted a very public execution of Jesus to humiliate Jesus as much as possible, and perhaps send a message that no other ideas, no other saviors will be tolerated except the ones that they thought were fit for Israel. And so comes the next step, manipulating Pilate to get what they want. Pilate was governor of Judea and was in town with his troops to control the mob. The city's numbers had swollen to many, many more thousands, pilgrims that have come for the Passover feast. The Jewish mob of religious leaders dragged Jesus, bound no doubt with ropes, to the Tower of Antonia, the fortress which was built against the temple wall. The tower would be high enough to look over the wall and see what's going on in those inner courts of the temple. Pilate was forced to come out, though, to Gabbatha, the place where judgment would be taken, to satisfy the religious leaders who, in their hypocrisy, which was thick at this point, decided to go in would make them unclean. They presented the obviously beaten Jesus as a rebel who was inciting rebellion against Caesar, as though these Jewish leaders cared anything for Rome or for Caesar, for that matter. But they didn't take long to get Pilate in a position where he had to judge But it also didn't take long for Pilate to realize this whole thing was a sham, and he knew Jesus was innocent. However, learning that he was a Galilean, Pilate decided to send him to Herod Antipas. You remember him. He's the guy that beheaded John the Baptist less than 3 years before. Someone also quite famous. Herod finally gets to meet Jesus of Nazareth. He'd been wanting to meet him for some time. Now keep in mind, this is still before 7 o'clock in the morning. When word got to Herod, of course, he was in town for the Passover like everyone else. He was eager to meet this miracle worker. But when Jesus offered no miracles and no conversation, the meeting went south quickly. Now as Jesus' enemies growing more frustrated and more angry, the beatings continued, the mocking continued, the accusations became more inflamed. Herod and his soldiers mocked Jesus. They put an elegant robe on Jesus and then sent him back to Pilate. And for some reason, really, this made Pilate and Herod friends in some way. As before, maybe they didn't get along. That's what Scripture tells us. Then there is the second trial before Pilate. At this point, we know what happens. The religious leaders returned with Jesus, but this time they brought a crowd of loyal employees and guards and packed the court with a mob of duty-bound loyalists. In short, Pilate buckled. With each attempt to release Jesus, the leaders of the mob became more restless. The people became more restless. The rebel Barabbas, whose name literally means son of the father, Bar, which is son of, and of course Abba, his father, son of the father, he was an actual rebel and was well known to be such. And yet Pilate brings him out in order to appease the crowd. Well, they want blood, I'll give them something. And so he offers Barabbas. But then comes Jesus. Jesus is the true Son of the Father. And who does this crowd ask for? They're more ramped up than ever with determination to dutifully shout for Barabbas' release and Jesus' crucifixion. At that point, Pilate finally makes a declaration, declaring Jesus' innocence and that he would not be responsible for this man's blood. And so he publicly washes his hands. Things were moving quickly at this point. Jesus was then flogged. This was protocol for anyone that was about to be crucified. This was not unusual. But this was done with an item, with a handle, with leather strips attached to it. At the end of the leather straps were bone, metal, anything sharp. Jesus was tied to a post, more likely that he was tied standing up so that they could get the entire backside from his shoulders, down his back, down his buttocks, down his calves, 40 lashes, leaving no part of his body unmarked. And that would be important. That intensified the suffering on the cross, as his backside would be rubbing back and forth on that rough wood of the cross each time he tried to take a breath. It would take him to the edge of his life as each strike would grab hold of flesh and tear away at his body, till finally he was bleeding and could barely stand. Now the Roman guards carry on after they're done flogging. After Jesus had been scourged, his clothes returned to him. The governor's soldiers then dragged Jesus into the praetorium, the soldiers' quarters, where the whole rest of the company were gathered for some sport. They stripped him back down to nothing, put a scarlet robe on his bloodied back. And anyone knows, if they've torn a Band-Aid off an open wound, they know how much that hurts. Imagine when they tore the robe off of Jesus' back, how much damage that would do and how much it hurt. And of course, they were cruel. These Romans had no love for Jews and were more than happy to express their hatred with Jesus. They wove a crown of thorns and wedged it onto his head. They mocked him mercifully, "Hail, King of the Jews." They spit on him, and then they took the staff that they'd used as the king's scepter, mockingly, of course, and they struck him on the head several times, over and over again, the scriptures tell us.